The dawn arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a sudden, jarring barrage. A cascade of luminous rectangles demanding immediate attention painted across the face of modern existence. Alarms blared, notifications pulsed like urgent little heartbeats, and emails accumulated in stacks we were told to attend to before the coffee had even cooled. It was a morning steeped not in possibility, but in relentless obligation. We began our day already behind, chasing phantom deadlines set by invisible hands. We moved through the routine of getting ready for the world, juggling tasks like scattered worries. The checklist expanded into an infinite scroll of must-dos. First thing, the urgent meeting. Next, the forgotten commitment to call a friend. Then, the inevitable task of replying to that demanding message sent late at night. Our minds, poor and overstretched things, were not truly engaged in any one place, but constantly jumping between them. We functioned on scattered attention, believing that breadth equaled depth, that sheer volume constituted productivity. This constant noise became a soundtrack to our lives. It was the ceaseless pinging of perceived emergencies, the rapid-fire exchange of superficial information, and the inner monologue screaming a litany of tasks. Every minute passed under the tyranny of if I don't do this right now, something terrible will happen. We lived in a perpetual state of cognitive urgency, mistaking frantic activity for actual progress. The to-do list, once a simple organizational aid, had transformed into an emotional weight, a physical manifestation of anxiety. The body moves forward while the mind is everywhere and nowhere. We pour our focus out onto the digital ether, leaving the self neglected at the center. We treat attention like a finite resource, depleting it minute by minute on tasks that often do not matter in the grand sweep of time. A profound exhaustion settled into the bones, and weariness that transcended mere sleep deprivation. It was the fatigue of fractured focus. It is in this wreckage of morning routine, surrounded by accumulated urgency, that the first whispers of discord begin. A moment pauses. The phone screen flashes a reminder for something trivial, a password reset or a meal delivery confirmation. But beneath the surface chatter, something else surfaces. A sudden question about why we are so easily distracted from the simple act of simply being. The instinct is to grab another device, another piece of entertainment, just to silence the intellectual itch. Yet, resisting that impulse feels strangely compelling. The character finds themselves stopping mid-stride, perhaps near a window looking out onto an ordinary street. The sheer density of external stimuli, the passing cars, the hurried footsteps, the brightly colored signs, suddenly seems overwhelming, not with wonder but with fatigue. We are taught to manage our schedules, to optimize every single waking moment. We treat time as money, and therefore, any deviation from a planned schedule feels like a financial loss. But what if time is not something to be optimized? What if it is merely a river, flowing whether we chart its course or not? The ancient texts suggest that the most crucial tasks are often those which require no actionable output: observation, reflection, and patience. To stop the perpetual forward motion, to embrace stasis as a philosophical starting point. It is here, at this moment of exhausted suspension, that the shadow of deeper wisdom falls across the chaotic morning scene. The mind drifts past the immediate alerts and schedules, instead conjuring distant echoes. Are these deadlines truly urgent in the face of mortality? Is replying to this email more important than cultivating genuine inner calm? Who designed the system that requires us to measure our self-worth by the sheer volume of tasks completed? The external noise, the blare of horns, the insistent chimes, the ringing phone, suddenly loses its power. It becomes merely sound, data points in a symphony of distraction, rather than commands demanding obedience. This realization is not sudden enlightenment, but a slow, difficult weaning from habit. It begins with noticing the boundary between what truly requires action and what merely demands our emotional energy. The struggle shifts from managing the external world to reclaiming internal sovereignty. The protagonist might take a deep breath, feeling the cool air settle in their lungs. They look at the ever-present digital dashboard of obligations, and for the first time, they do not feel fear or panic. Instead, there is a detached curiosity. What if we tried, just for 1 hour, to treat these external pressures not as mandates, but simply as suggestions? To let them exist without forcing our entire sense of self to revolve around their completion. The weight begins to lift slightly. The checklist remains sprawling and intimidating, yet its immediacy evaporates. It fades from a critical threat into merely paper. The noise did not vanish entirely. The city continued its ceaseless clamor, but the perceived significance of that noise diminished exponentially. This initial resistance to frantic productivity is the first step toward intellectual freedom. It teaches us to discern the essential signal from the overwhelming static. And this quiet act, simply refusing to be dictated by the schedule, marks the true beginning of philosophy applied to modern life. The city park bustled with life. Sunlight dappled through the leaves, painting fleeting mosaics on the gravel path beneath our feet. It was a familiar scene of modern leisure, yet it felt different today. Earlier, amidst the relentless demands of my daily schedule, my mind had been racing, tethered to the glowing screens and ticking clocks of obligation. The rhythm of life seemed dictated by external metrics: appointments kept, deadlines met, emails answered. I walked, observing the casual interactions around me, a couple laughing, a child chasing a stray ball, but feeling oddly detached, as if watching my own life through thick glass. And then it happened. As I paused beneath an arching bough, a sense of quiet clarity settled over the internal noise. It was not a sudden answer, but more like the gentle lifting of a veil. Suddenly, the casual chaos of the park became a backdrop against which something older and deeper began to whisper. The whispers were not external. They arose from a deep wellspring within me, echoing faint images. Figures cloaked in simple tunics, bodies gathered around a sunlit circle, Socrates debating passionately, Epictetus gesturing with practiced ease. These echoes pulled me away from the immediate present. I was transported across centuries, standing where philosophy once thrived. Here, genuine conversation was not about efficient time management or maximizing output. It was about the self. The air felt different, heavy with unspoken questions and profound inquiry. It was a realization that the urgent things of my modern life, the missed calls, the upcoming presentation, were merely distractions from the true business of living. A question began to surface, delicate yet insistent, like water finding the lowest point in a basin. What is truly meaningful? If I spent all my energy chasing external validation or accumulating markers of success, was that accumulation actually leading me toward peace, or simply deeper into anxiety? The voices were not judgmental, but genuinely inquisitive. They suggested that much of my modern striving was based on misunderstanding what I lacked. I found myself listening intently, trying to grasp the shape of their wisdom. It seemed they pointed away from things, away from money, away from reputation, even away from physical comfort, and directly toward judgment itself. The core lesson resonated. That suffering often arrives not with an overwhelming catastrophe, but with a subtle disagreement we have with reality. The ancient perspectives taught me that the arena of conflict is seldom outside our control. If I were to wait for peace to find me, I would be eternally delayed by circumstance, by other people's choices, or by unavoidable external forces. True freedom, therefore, lay not in changing the world around me, but in fundamentally altering the lens through which I viewed it. The whisper became more direct, addressing my personal struggle. Why do you believe that happiness is a destination? If it requires reaching a certain point or achieving perfect stability, then life itself becomes an unbearable process of falling short. Perhaps joy is not the reward for good behavior, but rather the byproduct of accepting what is at this moment. This required a slow, deliberate turning inward. I realized that my constant need to achieve, to control every variable, my career path, my relationships, even the day's weather, was simply an avoidance mechanism. It was fear wearing the disguise of responsibility. I was trying to build an impermeable shield against uncertainty, and in doing so, I had built a life full of exquisite tension. The echoes from the forum encouraged me to view obstacles not as punishments or derailments, but as raw material for understanding. A setback is merely information. It shows us where our expectations do not align with reality. The challenge was learning to treat that information without immediate emotional panic, to greet failure not with self-recrimination, but with a measured curiosity. What did this experience teach me about my own resilience? What core belief of mine failed in the face of this reality? This process felt like archaeology, excavating away layers of cultural expectation and modern conditioning to find something solid underneath. I began to see that the wisdom these ancients offered was not a dusty relic, but a living methodology for engaging with the bewildering complexity of existence. It demanded immense patience, an opposite virtue to the rapid-fire demands of my digital age. Instead of seeking immediate answers or quick fixes, it asked me to simply observe the process of becoming. The gentle weight of their questioning pressed upon me. Are you judging life as insufficient? Or are you merely experiencing the natural ebb and flow that characterizes all things beautiful and flawed? To accept the imperfection of the moment, the messy coffee spill, the unexpected delay, the inability to perfectly predict tomorrow, became synonymous with acceptance itself. This was not passive resignation. It was an active choice to find value in the continuous act of living, flaws and all. I started walking again, but this time my attention remained anchored. The modern park retained its bustle, but now the noise felt manageable. It wasn't chaos, it was simply life happening. I understood then that the most profound conversation I would ever have required only silence, the silent conversation with myself, guided by the echoes of wisdom spanning millennia, pointing toward a single truth. True fulfillment does not reside in mastering the external world, but in quietly mastering the landscape of one's own mind. We move through life, constantly pulling at the threads of what we think we must control. We build intricate walls around our desires and expectations, believing that if only we could predict outcomes or force things to align perfectly, then true peace would follow. But look closely at those walls. They are built upon a foundation of anxiety, because most of what we fight for is simply the illusion of perfect mastery over an unpredictable universe. Think back to the echo chamber of our modern lives, where notifications screamed demands and to-do lists suggested that if we did not check every box, we risked catastrophic failure. We mistook busyness for meaning, activity for stability. But as we found in the quiet spaces between the chaos, we must start to distinguish sharply between what is truly ours to command and what belongs entirely to fate. The heart of this struggle lies in our judgment. It is not the train that delays us, or the coffee that spills its dark bounty across the clean tile floor. It is the narrative we immediately attach to these events. We say, This cannot happen, or worse, this should never have happened. And that immediate, visceral reaction, that burst of frustration, that moment where we feel wronged by circumstance, is where our suffering takes root. It is a deeply human tendency to assign personal blame and intense significance to every minor inconvenience. We act as if the universe operates like an obedient servant, waiting for us to issue the perfect command. Now be orderly. Now be predictable. But fate cares nothing for our meticulously crafted schedules or our emotional needs. Fate flows with its own magnificent indifference, a flow that is powerful and utterly uncaring of our petty frustrations. This realization, this gentle blow from reality, must shock us out of our self-importance. We must learn to view setbacks not as personal attacks or cosmic injustices, but simply as data points in the vast, indifferent movement of existence. Consider the philosopher who learned to find freedom in acceptance. His insight was not that life would become easier, but that his internal reaction to life could change entirely. He understood that resistance is exhausting and often futile. To struggle against the natural course of things, to rage at the spilled coffee or curse the late train, is merely adding a second layer of pain on top of the original inconvenience. The true discipline is not in fixing the world. It is in mastering the space between stimulus and response. That crucial gap, that breath taken before we judge the event as terrible, that is where our power resides. It is here that freedom lives. If an external event occurs, the unexpected criticism from a colleague, the failure of a cherished plan, the sudden downturn in fortune, we must pause. We must remember that while the event itself belongs to the flow of things outside us, our judgment about that event, our determination that it should have been different or that it is intolerable, that belonging resides entirely within the citadel of our own mind. This is where we reclaim sovereignty. The world will continue its orbit whether we are prepared for it or not. Life does not pause because we feel stressed. Life merely continues. And in that continuation, there lies a profound and necessary freedom. We are forced to shed the comforting but ultimately damaging delusion that control is possible or even desirable. Accepting this randomness is not giving up. It is gaining something infinitely more valuable: inner resilience. It is recognizing the monumental difference between desiring things to be different and understanding how they actually are. This shift in perspective allows us to approach life's inevitable imperfections, the flawed systems, the unpredictable people, the moments of sheer misfortune, with a new kind of equanimity. We begin to see adversity not as an interruption to our goals, but as the very material of our practice. Adversity is the gym where character is built. It asks us to move past the childish need for everything to fit into neat, manageable boxes, and instead to embrace the sprawling, beautiful messiness of reality itself. We start to treat every disappointment not as proof of our failure, but as a necessary lesson in humility and acceptance. For only when we accept that much is beyond our reach can we begin the quiet work of focusing on what remains, the unwavering strength of our own minds, the steady rhythm of our virtuous choices, and the profound grace found in simply letting go. The noise had finally subsided. It was not a sudden silence, but rather the gentle settling of dust after a storm. Having spent so long battling the endless demands placed upon her, the deadlines, the expectations, the constant pull toward external achievement, she found herself in a place defined by stillness. A quiet room, sunlight slanting through dusty windows, filled with the scent of old paper and patient knowledge. This moment was different from any she had experienced before. She was no longer running from something or chasing something. There was just being. In her hand rested a small, worn piece of parchment, perhaps a fragment of an ancient journal. It contained only a few lines, a maxim echoing the profound simplicity of human endurance. The words spoke not of monumental feats or grand achievements, but of the simple act of enduring the present moment with grace and understanding. They suggested that true strength was not found in mastering the world around you, but in mastering the space within you, the sacred ground between a stimulus and your response. It struck her then, with startling clarity, how much she had been mistaking motion for progress. She believed that if she simply kept moving faster, or planned harder, or worried more intensely, she would finally arrive at a state of peace. Yet the relentless internal churn proved otherwise. The farther she ran from herself, the more fragmented her mind became. The ancient wisdom presented itself not as a set of difficult rules to obey, but as a fundamental shift in perspective, a kind of inner recalibration. It was an invitation to stop analyzing life and simply observe it. She began to consider the weight of control. In the chapters that followed, she had started learning to distinguish between what was genuinely within her sphere of influence and what belonged to the indifferent river of fate. She understood that the things outside, the unpredictable delays, the criticism of others, the passing seasons, were simply given to her existence. They were facts, not judgments upon her worth. But there remained a lingering temptation, the desire to control the narrative, to smooth over every unexpected wrinkle and delay. This attachment to predictability was perhaps the most exhausting struggle of all. To accept that life is inherently messy, unpredictable, and sometimes unjust. This realization felt terrifyingly liberating. What if peace required not constant effort or intense philosophical study, but simply a radical act of non-resistance, a gentle yielding to what already is? She remembered the advice given earlier, to view every setback not as a catastrophe, but as raw material for character building. The spilled coffee was not an accident demanding apology. It was merely brown, liquid staining fabric. Missing the train was not proof of her failure. It was simply a detour on a day already unfolding. This understanding allowed her mind, which had been racing with contingency plans and what-if scenarios, to slow down. The ceaseless demand for certainty began to lose its power. She started treating her own anxieties with the same detached curiosity she gave to random gusts of wind passing through the leaves of a tree. The inner anchor, she realized, was not some external object or guaranteed condition. It was a steady point within her core consciousness, accessible only when she ceased projecting narratives onto reality. The self-critical voice that had been her most relentless companion finally began to soften, losing its sharp edges and accusatory tone. Instead of fighting it, she began to listen, to acknowledge the fear without accepting it as truth. The philosophy wasn't about being perfectly calm all the time. It was about developing the capacity for resilience. It was the steady knowing that even when storms hit, even when plans crumble into irrelevance, the core self remains untouched, fundamentally intact. This inner stability is her anchor. It holds fast not in times of ease, but precisely in moments of bewildering turmoil. She finally understood that wisdom was less about accumulating knowledge and more about refining attention, directing it consistently back to the quiet truth. You are here, right now, doing what must be done with integrity and acceptance. The continuous practice of returning focus, again and again, to the present moment, became her most profound meditation. This slow, deliberate refocusing was the truest form of self-mastery she had ever known. She did not need grand revelations. She needed only mindful return. We have spent so much time fighting the world, fighting deadlines, fighting expectations, fighting every minor inconvenience that dared to disrupt our careful plans. And in this constant struggle against external forces, we often forget where the truest battlefield lies. The war is not outside, it is within. It resides in the turbulent spaces between one thought and the next, within the chambers of our own judgment. The self we meet now is not a unified spirit, but a crowd of competing voices. There is the voice that whispers constant fear, the fear of failure, the panic of inadequacy. There is the sharper, more abrasive voice of comparison, looking sideways at another life and deeming it superior to our own reality. This relentless inner critic, this restless ego, demands perfection as a prerequisite for worthiness. It tells us we are not yet enough. It refuses rest. It fuels perpetual dissatisfaction. To fight these voices, however, is itself a form of struggle. We try to suppress the fear, to silence the criticism, treating them like external enemies that must be defeated in some imagined battle. But this only exhausts us further. The war cannot be won by brute force or sheer willpower. It requires something far more subtle, understanding and disengagement. The first lesson here is radical non-identification. We must observe these thoughts as mere weather patterns passing through the mind, like clouds across a boundless sky. They are not facts of our identity. They are simply electrical signals of an emotional state. When the voice screams that we have failed, we do not reply with defensiveness. We pause and acknowledge, I notice the thought that I am inadequate. This single act separates us from the idea, granting instant emotional distance. It turns the accuser into merely a commentator. The ego loves narratives of victimhood and struggle, because those stories give it purpose. To fight these internal demons means refusing to participate in their drama. It means realizing that the core belief driving much modern anxiety is an imagined fragility. The notion that if things deviate even slightly from our perfect narrative, we will dissolve into chaos. The deepest work of this chapter is learning to stop reacting to the self-criticism. When a fear arises, a cold dread about the future, perhaps, our natural instinct is to grasp at it, to analyze it until it seems solid and dangerous. But what happens if we practice letting go of the grip? If we look at that dreadful feeling not as an imminent threat, but simply as a raw emotional sensation, like tension in the chest or a flutter in the stomach. The realization is profound. Most internal battles are fought over hypothetical scenarios, what-ifs. We build elaborate mental castles based on fears that may never materialize. And because these what-if scenarios have no substance in the present moment, dwelling within them only guarantees discomfort. Mastery, therefore, becomes an exercise in radical returning to the simple truth of the present breath. When the internal noise swells, when comparison strikes, when panic whispers its urgency, we anchor ourselves to sensory input, the feel of our feet on the floor, the steady rhythm of inhalation and exhalation. This physical grounding acts like a bridle on the runaway thought train. The battle is not against fear itself. It is against the compulsion to treat that feeling as if it were truth. It is realizing that emotion is transient energy, not permanent identity. We practice meta-mindfulness, extending not just kindness outward, but first inward, offering compassion to the distressed self, to acknowledge the pain without accepting its narrative validity. The most profound resistance we face in this chapter is the seductive comfort of familiar negative patterns. It feels safer to be predictable in our anxiety than it does to embrace the unsettling neutrality of simply being. The restlessness of the ego demands stimulation, drama, and struggle. Peace, by contrast, can feel suspiciously boring, a gentle, unearned stillness that our modern consciousness often interprets as stagnation or decay. But true growth only happens when we cultivate this inner solitude. When we step back from the stage of self-judgment and simply observe the play unfolding, the fear, the anger, the demanding voice, we recognize ourselves not as the drama, but as the quiet witness observing it all. This detached observation is our armor. It is freedom's highest attainment, seeing reality clearly, unclouded by the stories we tell ourselves about what should be, or what was lost. This internal battlefield demands patience. We do not seek immediate conquest. We seek sustained vigilance, the gentle commitment to showing up for the self, moment after moment, without judgment of effort. For it is only in mastering this inner terrain that we can hope to live a life guided by wisdom rather than reaction. Life is not always kind. At times, the careful plans we build with such earnest effort unravel. A connection falters, a journey is thwarted, or a deeply held certainty dissolves like smoke in the wind. These moments of breakdown are often perceived as tragedy, signs of failure that demand resistance. We instinctively grasp at the thread of how it should be, fighting against reality's unpredictable drift. Yet this fierce struggle to mandate order upon chaos exhausts us. It teaches us nothing except the weight of our own desire for things to simply yield to our will. The ancient understanding offers a profound alternative: acceptance. This is not merely passive resignation, nor is it indifference. True acceptance, or Amor Fati, is an embrace, a fierce, loving affirmation of everything that has been, is, and inevitably must be. It means transforming what we resist into the very fuel for our transformation. Instead of asking why this has happened to me, we learn to ask with curiosity, how shall I meet this? To embrace fate's decree is not surrender. It is an act of profound, radical power. It allows us to stop spending energy fighting the current and instead paddle with intention within its flow. This journey into acceptance requires a constant dismantling of our expectations. Our minds are highly skilled at predicting futures and judging those predictions against actual outcomes. When life deviates from our script, when the rain falls on the sunny day, or when the person we trusted chooses a different path, we feel betrayed by reality itself. We treat these deviations as external wrongs that require fixing, demanding reparations from time or circumstance. The shift is subtle but revolutionary, recognizing that the fault lies not with the event itself, but with our narrative around it. The spilled cup of coffee is merely brown liquid on a floor. It only becomes a disaster when we label it so. Similarly, the derailed plan does not hold intrinsic moral weight. It simply happened. And by giving up the fight to control what cannot be controlled, the whims of others, the fickle nature of fortune, the past, we free ourselves to focus on one sacred point, our immediate response. This practice is a sustained meditation on what is. It compels us to strip away the comforting illusions of perfect narrative arc and stable predictability. The world, in its grand complexity, operates with magnificent indifference to human desires or timelines. Sometimes, things simply do not work out. A relationship ends not because of a flaw in character, but because two separate currents have naturally diverged. A career path dissolves, not due to incompetence, but because the landscape demands a new kind of traveler. The inner conflict that arises from this acceptance is immense. It feels like giving up. The ego screams protest, demanding reassurance, wanting to rewrite the ending. We cling to the memory of times when things were simpler, more controllable, and thus we suffer acute nostalgia for an illusionary past. To accept today's messiness means acknowledging that stability itself might be a myth, replaced only by continuous motion and adaptation. The path forward demands courage, the steady willingness to stand in the space of discomfort without flinching or scrambling for the comfort of what if. It requires accepting imperfection not just in others, but within ourselves. Our failures are not character indictments. They are data points. They are necessary lessons etched into the self by the force of reality. We begin to see that suffering is often a misguided attempt at meaning-making. We try to make random occurrences fit into neat patterns of cause and effect because our minds crave narrative security. But fate offers us something wilder, something more honest. The art of acceptance thus becomes the mastery of continuous surrender, the willingness to welcome what happens fully. It is embracing not just the good things, but also the grinding difficulty, the unavoidable setback, the profound disappointment. We learn to treat these setbacks not as obstacles blocking a desired path, but as the very material needed for our unique construction. Every failure becomes a lesson in resilience. Every unexpected turn forces us to develop adaptability. This acceptance does not negate emotion. If we grieve a loss, we feel the grief fully. But after the wave of sorrow subsides, accepting means knowing that this particular configuration of pain is simply part of the current human experience, and it will pass. It allows the intensity of the feeling to become informative rather than debilitating. We stop asking why me, and start whispering what next. The realization dawns that our freedom resides not in selecting a perfect life story, but in becoming profoundly skillful at living any life story, the one with the unexpected deviations, the sudden disappointments, the sheer, messy indifference of existence. It is in that complete embrace of all things that we finally find true peace, the knowledge that we are inherently capable of carrying whatever reality grants us. This radical acceptance transforms burden into gift, and resistance into effortless flow. The journey toward understanding the self has often felt like wading through a fog of confusion. We carry with us a profound and exhausting habit of trying to control everything: the economy, other people's opinions, random misfortune, even the weather. It is natural to want mastery over every variable that touches our lives. Yet, wisdom whispers a radical truth. Much of what we labor so hard to adjust or prevent simply falls outside the boundaries of our own power. We spend so much energy pushing against the currents, the deadlines we cannot meet, the words others speak that cut deep, the circumstances that conspire against our plans. We define ourselves by what happens to us. But this constant struggle creates a profound internal exhaustion, a weariness that settles not in the muscles, but in the spirit itself. Think back to the sources of your greatest stress. Is it typically an event in itself, or is it the judgment you attach to that event? The spilled coffee is merely liquid and ceramic. The late train is simply delayed steel on a track. These events are neutral. They possess no inherent moral quality, no intrinsic rightness or wrongness. Suffering begins only when we label these neutral facts as threats, as intolerable violations of how the world ought to be. This realization demands a sharp and difficult mental discipline, learning to draw an invisible but absolute line between what belongs to us and what does not. This is the essential architecture of Stoic freedom. On one side stands everything external, other people's actions, market fluctuations, bad luck, even our own bodies aging against our will. These are all wild variables gifted to us by fate, beyond the reach of our direct command. And on the other side stands the inner citadel, our judgments, our assessments, the moment between the stimulus and the response. This space, this fragile, golden interval, is where true power resides. It is here that we have the singular authority to intervene. We cannot force a person to respect us, nor can we command the storm to halt its passage. But in the heart of our own mind, we always retain the ultimate veto. Imagine running into someone whose behavior wounds you deeply. The initial, instinctual surge is anger, a visceral reaction that demands immediate redress or blame. We are swept away by the story. They meant this, they know better, they are selfish. But disciplined introspection forces a pause. What we must ask ourselves is not what they did, but how I am choosing to interpret what they did. Am I judging their action based on my own unmet expectation? Am I treating them as if they were obligated to manage my emotional comfort? This separation is far more complex than merely listing things that are external and things that are internal. It requires a complete remapping of reality itself. It means acknowledging that when we worry about outcomes, we are fundamentally trying to live in a state of absolute prediction, a state that human nature simply cannot sustain. Life is messy, unpredictable, and delightfully non-linear. The practice is therefore one of constant mental revision. Every time an external event throws us off balance, every time fear dictates our response, we must interrupt the internal narrative. We must resist the comforting lie that giving a reason for something will make it feel manageable. Instead, we train ourselves to observe the fact. This is happening. And then we move to the second step. How do I choose to regard this fact? Our judgments are not merely thoughts. They are entire systems of belief about how things must be. When that system encounters reality, the cold bath, the rejection letter, the disappointing conversation, it registers dissonance and screams alarm. The goal is to dismantle that judgmental machinery gradually. We learn, over time, a profound emotional detachment from judgment itself. We realize that by letting go of the need for external events to validate our feelings or confirm our expectations, we unlock an inexhaustible source of calm. Our peace does not depend on clear skies, comfortable finances, or the approval of others. It depends solely upon our ability to govern the landscape within. To change what is outside of us requires a power that does not exist for humankind. But to master the way we think about what is outside of us, that, my friends, remains forever within our command. And in that freedom, the quiet sovereignty over one's own mind, we find a resilience far stronger than any material possession or achieved status could ever provide. We have learned that much of our suffering is not caused by the world itself, but by the judgments we attach to it. We began this journey recognizing the sheer volume of external pressure, the endless demands and notifications that screamed for our attention. We slowly moved toward understanding where our control truly ended, discovering that while we cannot predict tomorrow's chaos or dictate others' actions, we possess absolute sovereignty over our inner response. Our minds were once volatile things, tossed about by every passing thought or perceived slight. To confront the world was often to first confront ourselves, particularly the urgent internal whispers of fear and judgment. Now, we stand at a crucial threshold, the space between what happens and how we choose to live in it. It is here that true mastery resides. This chapter demands nothing less than total presence, an unwavering commitment to noticing our own habitual drift toward reactivity. Reactivity, in its purest form, is automatic. It is the visceral jolt, the spike of immediate anger when plans fail, the sharp intake of breath of panic when expectations crumble. It is the impulse to blame the coffee spill, or the late train, or the words spoken carelessly by a loved one. These reactions are swift and total, consuming our rational thought and reducing us merely to reflexes. But there is an alternative. There is a response, and choosing that space, the pause between stimulus and action, is perhaps the most challenging philosophical discipline we will ever practice. It is not enough simply to know that one should wait. One must learn how to exist in that waiting, to hold the uncomfortable silence before speaking, acting, or judging. The difficulty lies in what happens inside that gap. The instinctual mind hates the pause. It demands resolution. It wants an explanation, a justification for the distress. But true wisdom teaches us that sometimes no explanation is necessary, and resistance only fuels the fire. To choose a response means acknowledging the original stimulus, the trigger, the slight, the disappointment, but refusing to allow it to define our internal state. It means treating the event not as an indictment of who we are, but merely as data, a piece of external reality that requires careful assessment. Consider the high-pressure social interaction, or the moment when truth and convenience clash in real time. We might feel ourselves hardening, preparing for battle against injustice or perceived failure. The knee-jerk reaction is to deploy defense mechanisms, the sharp retort, the stony silence, the desperate argument. These reactions protect a fragile sense of self, but often damage genuine connection and peace. They are built on assumptions, that our opinion matters more than the other person's humanity, that our feeling must be immediately validated. The path away from reaction requires us to consciously slow down the emotional current. It is a deliberate act of intellectual rebellion against the primal urge to simply feel everything and express it immediately. Instead, we practice an almost surgical detachment. We learn to identify the raw emotion, the hot burst of anger, the cold shock of disappointment, and then gently pull back, asking ourselves, is this feeling accurate? Am I conflating a momentary inconvenience with fundamental harm? Is my immediate urge rooted in objective fact, or is it woven from years of fear and expectation? This pause allows for profound shifts in perspective. When we create that buffer zone, the event itself often loses some of its sharp power. The spilled coffee remains mere liquid. The late train remains simply delayed metal on tracks. They cease to be moral failures or personal assaults. They become neutral facts. Choosing a response is thus an act of profound self-mastery. It is admitting that while we cannot control the torrent of life, the rude comment, the sudden financial blow, the betrayal, we can absolutely dictate the quality of the river within our own chests. We are not merely observers of our emotions, we are curators of them. We build a careful intellectual and emotional architecture around ourselves, recognizing that this inner fortress is the only thing genuinely ours to protect. The work required here is not passive acceptance, though it often looks like it. It is an active discipline, the constant, mindful effort to question the assumed validity of our distress. It means viewing every interpersonal conflict as a philosophical examination, not a battle to be won, but a paradox to be understood. We learn that genuine wisdom does not lie in eliminating difficult emotions, for they are inherent parts of being human. Instead, it lies in mastering the discipline of non-attachment from those emotions' dramatic narratives. It is allowing them to pass through us like clouds across a vast sky, acknowledging their presence without letting them dictate our trajectory or darken our inner landscape. This subtle, constant choice, the shift from reflex to thought, is where we find resilience. It rebuilds our capacity for grace under pressure. We begin to see that true power is not the ability to fight external forces, but the quiet, unshakable authority over our own ascent. And in that sovereignty of mind resides a peace far deeper and more reliable than any comfort the world can offer. We have spent time learning to distinguish what is within our control from what simply happens around us. We learned that the initial reaction, fueled by fear or expectation, often serves only to deepen the struggle. Mastery demands a pause, a deliberate breath in the space between event and judgment. This discipline of pausing has allowed us to build an inner wall, protecting the quiet core of self from the unpredictable tides of circumstance. But even this measured response is not enough if we remain blind to loss. True resilience requires preparing for the inevitable absence. We have traveled far from the frantic rhythm of expectation. We have learned to pause when the external world demands instant reaction. We understood that much suffering arises not from a failed effort, but from the demanding internal narrative we write around those failures. Our attention has been honed, moving away from the fleeting chaos of notifications and towards the steady beat of awareness itself. But what is it, truly, to define a life well lived? Throughout our journey, we have practiced acceptance, the quiet embrace of what is, and we have mastered the art of separating events beyond our power from our own internal choices. Yet, sometimes, we catch ourselves drifting back toward an old myth, the belief that success must look like something grand and measurable. We watch others striving in dazzling displays of achievement, marked by wealth, recognition, or visible milestones of status. Their lives seem to scream a definition of worth. If I have this much, then I am valuable. If I achieve this title, then my existence matters. It is an exhausting pursuit, fueled by comparison and the perpetual need for external validation. We mistake accumulation for fulfillment. But what if the metrics we use to measure our success are fundamentally flawed? What if they measure only output, never internal peace? This chapter asks us to truly rethink that definition. Success, as the world parades it, is often a fragile house of cards, built atop the shifting sands of other people's expectations. It requires endless effort simply to maintain the facade of perpetual ascent. We must ask ourselves, am I building this life for myself, or merely fulfilling a script written by society? The journey has been a slow ascent from the noise of external expectations to the quiet discipline of the self. We have learned that many struggles we face are not battles against the world, but rather disagreements with ourselves, misconceptions about what freedom really means. The ancient philosophies offered tools, the careful separation between what is within our command and what remains entirely outside it. These were maps for a more measured life, guiding us away from reaction and toward reasoned response. But understanding theory is vastly different from practicing wisdom. It is one thing to know that true power lies in cultivating stillness. It is another thing entirely to maintain that stillness when the day itself demands noise. And so, we arrive at the virtue practice. This chapter is not meant to be a lecture on virtues like justice or courage. Instead, it must become the embodiment of them. Virtue does not live solely within careful study or thoughtful reflection. It lives in the small, awkward moments. The choice to speak gently when anger feels automatic. The difficult decision to sacrifice immediate convenience for long-term integrity. The quiet act of simply observing oneself without judgment. The theory has led us to understanding boundaries. We have learned that our inner peace is not something external circumstances can grant. It must be built brick by conscious brick through disciplined action. This means transforming abstract concepts, like fortitude or temperance, into lived experience. It requires the profound shift from recognizing a principle in the library to embodying that principle while standing in the harsh light of reality. Consider the concept of justice, for example. We may read about Cicero detailing its importance, but what does it mean when we disagree with a friend? When our own ego demands that we be proven right? Justice at that moment is not merely intellectual agreement. It is the willingness to listen fully, even when the words spoken are difficult to hear. It requires the courage to restrain one's immediate verdict in favor of compassionate understanding. The practice calls for us to take what has been built intellectually and test it against friction. We must find the seams where our polished philosophy meets the rough edges of everyday human interaction. Where does self-discipline fail when fatigue sets in? Where does patience break under sustained, irritating repetition? These are the true classrooms, far more challenging than any ancient forum. The transformation is not a sudden epiphany. It is an accumulation of small choices. It is noticing that when faced with injustice, the slight misunderstanding, the unfair accusation, your initial instinct whispers retribution or withdrawal. But through disciplined pause, you remember the discipline taught by the Stoics. Observe the urge, name it, and then choose differently. You consciously root yourself in the present moment, recalling the inner anchor discovered moments earlier. This practice requires a deep dive into self-correction. It means facing not just the big failures, the massive mistakes or moral lapses, but the small erosions of character. The quick sigh of frustration when traffic slows, the immediate judgment hurled at an unknown passerby, the moment you choose complaint over gratitude. These moments are invisible battlegrounds, and mastering them is where true self-mastery resides. The journey becomes a perpetual feedback loop. We identify a vice or weakness, perhaps a tendency toward gossip or impatience with inefficiency. Then, in our daily lives, we actively seek out the conditions that will trigger that weakness. We do not avoid difficulty. Rather, we greet it as necessary training. We treat life itself as a rigorous gymnasium for the spirit. This mindful effort cultivates what is often called arete or excellence of character. It is the quiet accumulation of small acts of virtue until they become instinctual, as natural and effortless as breathing. The disciplined man does not feel virtuous only after passing an exam. He simply lives virtuously because his internal standard has been raised so high that compromise feels utterly alien. We are learning to accept imperfection not merely in the world, but within ourselves. We understand that we will fail this practice just as often as we succeed it. The stumble is inevitable, but the true measure of wisdom, the ultimate virtue demonstrated here, is not perfection itself, but the speed and gentleness with which we pick ourselves up after falling. It is the willingness to acknowledge the slip, learn from the failure without self-condemnation, and immediately resume the upward ascent. The practice of virtue is therefore a sustained conversation, a dialogue that must occur moment by fleeting moment between who we currently are and who we know, fundamentally, we are capable of becoming. It is moving beyond mere understanding toward deep, compassionate embodiment. The destination is not an arrival point marked on a map. It is the steady rhythm of a heart beating in alignment with its highest self, day after measured day. We stand now at a quiet threshold, having traveled through the noise of external expectation. We have learned to differentiate between what is truly ours to command and what simply happens around us. We have faced the echoing chaos of self-doubt and the sharp demands of an imperfect world. Yet sometimes, even after mastering the response, we find ourselves in a room with only ourselves for company. To speak with oneself is not merely repeating thoughts. It is a dialogue, an act of profound accountability. It requires us to become our own most truthful guide, recognizing both the struggle and the immense potential within that quiet space. Where did the critical voice come from? Who was afraid when failure felt inevitable? These are not questions for a book or a teacher outside ourselves. They demand the intimate courage of confronting one's inner landscape. We recall the times we judged our past selves too harshly. We criticized the impatience, the reactive bursts of anger, the ease with which comparison had distracted us from the simple dignity of simply being present. We were often harder on ourselves than any opponent could ever be. This self-critique, while seemingly necessary, carries its own weight, the burden of constantly demanding perfection that life itself does not guarantee. To engage in dialogue with the past self demands a shift in perspective. It is an act of compassionate observation. We must look back not through the lens of regret, but through the clarity of understanding. To recognize our former confusion as simply another stage of learning, to accept the struggles for patience and focus as necessary preparation. The inner conversation often becomes circular, a loop of worry about tomorrow, mixed with the lingering shame of yesterday. It tries to convince us that the past dictates the possibility of a better present, or that future uncertainty justifies current inaction. But philosophy teaches us that time is not merely linear, but directional. We are always moving toward this moment, and in this moment resides all our power. The true dialogue begins when we stop arguing with ourselves and start simply listening. What does the weary self need to hear? Perhaps it needs permission to be imperfect. Perhaps it requires acknowledgement for the vigilance required just to stay afloat amid modern demands. Acknowledging that fatigue is not a moral failure, but a natural outcome of an overstretched consciousness. This reflective process forces us to confront core narratives we have built around our identities. Are we defined by our accomplishments, by our titles, or are we defined only by the conscious choice we make in this very breath? It is difficult work, this journey inward. It means sitting with discomfort, with that quiet ache of self-recognition. It involves dismantling the elaborate internal scaffolding built up over years of defensive mechanisms and emotional hoarding. Every pattern of avoidance, every habit of distraction, represents a structure that must be dismantled brick by slow brick. Through this dialogue, we learn to distinguish between what is genuine insight and mere intellectual rumination. One is lived. It changes how you walk in the market. The other remains confined to the journal page. True wisdom does not reside in knowing the theory of self-acceptance, but in practicing the act of forgiving oneself for moments when that acceptance failed. This journey with the self is ultimately about cultivating a relationship of radical kindness, a stern yet gentle loyalty to one's own unfolding life. It means moving beyond simply managing emotions and toward understanding their origins, tracing a feeling of intense anxiety not merely back to a deadline, but perhaps years ago, to an unacknowledged fear of falling short. The self is both the greatest source of trouble and the deepest wellspring of grace. Confronting these two truths at once requires patience that feels endless and forgiveness that seems impossible. Yet this confrontation is precisely where mastery begins. We stop treating ourselves like projects requiring constant repair, and start treating ourselves like complex gardens that require careful tending. To be present with oneself means accepting the shadow alongside the light, the capacity for profound joy existing seamlessly beside the vulnerability of deep sadness. It means understanding that both feelings are simply energy passing through the system, nothing more. We do not need to eliminate them. We only need to observe their transit without judgment or attachment. This quiet self-dialogue does not yield a neat conclusion. It is an ongoing process, a commitment to continuous becoming. It teaches us that accountability starts at home, in the silent chambers of our own minds. And this, perhaps more than any conquering of external adversity, is the greatest victory we can achieve. The journey of the mind often convinces us that true satisfaction is a grand acquisition. We believe that joy waits at the end of some impressive achievement, or housed within a collection of accolades and possessions. We are taught, by the relentless rhythm of our modern lives, to constantly strive, to accumulate more experiences, more knowledge, more status. Yet, after grappling with the overwhelming tides of information and the demanding architecture of external success, we finally arrive at this quiet moment, a space defined not by what we do, but by what we simply are. The mind wanders, still tempted by the ghost weight of comparison. It pulls us back to lists, to imagined goals that seem perpetually just out of reach. But now, there is a subtle shift. The noise does not disappear entirely. Rather, it loses its critical authority. We begin to notice the sheer volume of our own making, the frantic energy spent attempting to control outcomes that were never meant to be controlled. We recall the fierce lessons learned, that the self-inflicted suffering arises from misunderstanding reality, and the liberating realization that the only boundary we truly govern is the space between an event occurring and us reacting to it. We have built a scaffold of discipline, learning to pause when instinct urges panic, finding our footing in the measured response rather than the automatic flare of emotion. This resilience, hard won through challenging oneself with virtues and confronting one's inner critic, feels almost foreign, yet utterly natural at the same time. The eye finds the gentle curve of a simple path, an unplanned detour into green space. It is not a destination highlighted on a map. It is simply here. And in this unscripted moment, the accumulated wisdom begins to settle, not as grand pronouncements, but as quiet understandings, like sunlight filtering through old leaves. We start tracing lines of thought that are fundamentally anti-achievement-oriented. They trace back to basics, the feeling of cool air on bare skin, the uneven rhythm of footsteps on dirt, the scent of damp earth after a light rain. These sensory details do not demand interpretation, they simply exist, and in their simple existence, there is an echo of perfect completeness. The profound revelation here is one of subtraction. To find joy in simplicity means recognizing that we have spent so much energy trying to add meaning, to patch together significance using professional titles or financial markers, that we forgot the effortless fullness that was always present. It is a radical act of letting go of expectation itself. We confront the notion that everything must be optimized, scheduled, and measured. The clock's tyranny loosens its grip. Time expands in these simple moments. We see how our previous anxiety about wasting time actually stemmed from mistaking busy for meaningful. Busy is merely motion. Meaningfulness is stillness imbued with presence. Consider the things that resist categorization, the slow unfolding of a flower petal, the effortless lift of wind through grass, the perfect imperfect curve of a weathered stone. These things teach us acceptance not as a duty, but as an inherent state of being. They ask nothing in return. They do not promise future perfection, nor do they apologize for their current form. They simply are. This appreciation requires training the mind to resist novelty addiction, the modern craving for the next exciting distraction. It is tempting to look away from the quiet because our neurological wiring anticipates the dopamine hit of the unknown stimulus. But we learn that true reward lies not in escaping monotony, but in mastering a deep engagement with it. Simplicity, then, becomes more than an aesthetic choice. It is a profound philosophical discipline. It is the deliberate practice of narrowing the focus until all unnecessary chatter fades into background hum. The objects around us, a patch of moss on a tree root, a clear droplet catching the light, become teaching tools. They remind us that complexity often masks a fundamental simplicity beneath. Joy, in this context, is not a temporary emotional high, achieved by external means. It is the sustainable equilibrium found when we align our internal perception with the inherent rhythm and grace of life as it unfolds. The weight lifts, replaced by a grounded sense of belonging to the present moment. We understand that cultivating inner peace does not require monumental acts of will or the resolution of global crises. It begins here, in choosing to feel the texture of the breeze against the cheek, in observing the subtle shift of light across the ground, in allowing our minds to wander without self-criticism. This is where we find the true anchor, not far off, waiting at a distant port, but rooted right here, in the gentle unfolding of being. The profound luxury is realizing that sufficient grace already exists, provided we quiet enough to finally see it. We have walked through the demanding architecture of self-improvement. We learn to build boundaries around our judgment, mastering the space between stimulus and response. We practice the radical embrace of fate, recognizing that every failure was not an end point, but a necessary piece of material for growth. We understood that success is measured not by external accumulation, but by the virtuous integrity with which we live each passing hour. Now comes the final, perhaps most difficult realization, the arduous pursuit of perfection itself. That striving, that constant push to be flawless in every domain, emotionally sound, professionally perfect, morally impeccable, is a weight far heavier than any mistake one might make. It is the single greatest enemy on the path toward wisdom. The mind naturally gravitates toward blueprints of ideal living. We are taught to fix ourselves, to eliminate flaws like errant thoughts or emotional flare-ups. We treat imperfections as moral failings, weaknesses requiring immediate correction. But what if this relentless desire for flawlessness is merely another form of self-imposed suffering? What if the belief that we must achieve a spotless existence keeps us perpetually anxious and forever incomplete? Consider the nature of life itself. Is perfection a human invention? Look around you, at the worn marble, chipped by time, at the intricate veins upon a leaf, each unique in its pattern, at the faces gathered here, marked by smiles and scars. None of it adheres to an immaculate standard. The universe thrives in its magnificent messiness. The quest for perfection demands a rigid adherence to rules. Never be late, always say the right thing, anticipate every outcome. This need for control forces us into endless vigilance. We become judges of our own lives, harshest critic among all people. But inner peace does not bloom in sterile conditions. It emerges in rich soil, nourished by struggle and marked by visible evidence of its journey. To expect seamless living is to build a life on shifting sand. When we inevitably falter, when the word stumbles, when the patience runs thin, when the deeply held belief fails us, we confront the illusion that smooth existence is possible. Embracing imperfection is not permission for negligence, nor is it an excuse for mediocrity. Rather, it is a profoundly powerful act of self-compassion and radical honesty. It means acknowledging that being human itself is inherently imperfect. We are beings of magnificent contradictions, capable of profound love, yet prone to deep misunderstanding, brilliant in thought, yet vulnerable to irrational fear. The core discipline we must now cultivate is the ability to receive our flaws with gentle acceptance, not the brittle denial of fault, but a soft recognition. I stumbled today. My logic failed me yesterday. My compassion faltered when I was exhausted this morning. And that is simply what it means to be alive and striving for goodness. Think of yourself not as a finished monument, which must only withstand time's ravages, but as a continuously evolving garden. A garden always requires weeding, pruning, and adaptation. Some leaves will brown in the autumn, some blossoms will fall too soon. These losses are not failures of cultivation, but cycles of life itself. We must learn to appreciate the whole cycle, the flourishing alongside the decay. This acceptance extends beyond self-judgment. It allows us to meet the unpredictable reality of others as they are. To accept a friend's flawed habit or a loved one's recurring mistake is not resignation. It is an act of conscious maturity that frees up enormous mental energy previously spent on demanding impossible standards from others. True freedom, finally and wholly, comes when we cease to battle the texture of existence itself. It means finding peace in the slight ache after a long journey, in the unexpected deviation from plan, in the beautiful sound of an imperfectly tuned instrument. The moment we stop trying to polish our souls into something unblemished, we suddenly find a profound lightness. The weight drops away. We realize that wholeness is not found by eliminating what breaks. It is found by integrating what has already bent and fractured. We are defined not by the absence of errors, but by the quality of our recovery from them. By the speed with which we rise after falling, by the grace with which we offer apologies for our inevitable missteps, and by the unwavering commitment to continue learning despite our deepest vulnerabilities. Let us therefore redefine good enough, not as settling, but as sufficient. Sufficient for this moment, sufficient for this breath. A life lived embracing its imperfections is a life lived in deep realism. It is messy, it is unpredictable, sometimes painfully difficult, but fundamentally, it is profoundly and gloriously real. The wisdom we seek was never the unattainable perfection that beckons from an idealized past or imagined future. It is here, right now, settled into the acceptance of this self, in this imperfect moment, realizing that the beautiful journey forward does not require a spotless map, only the willingness to take the next step regardless of the scrape on one's knees. We have traveled through the noise of constant demands and the illusion of control. We learned to stand firm when chaos struck, recognizing that much of our struggle was not with the world itself, but with our own judgments of it. The echoes of ancient thought guided us away from external metrics, success measured by wealth, or defined by perfect composure. Instead, we were drawn inward, back to a quiet core. This final journey is not about achieving some grand state of flawless perfection. Such a goal only breeds endless striving and disappointment. True wisdom, as we now understand it, has no fixed destination. It is not the conquering of all anxieties or the perfect execution of every plan. It is simply the way of walking, the rhythm maintained in the quiet spaces between moments. Think of a river stone, smoothed by ceaseless current. Its beauty does not lie in being polished for display, but in enduring the flow itself. Remember that profound exhaustion we felt at the beginning, that constant tension of trying to optimize every single minute, that hunger to achieve, always needing one more accomplishment to validate our existence. We learned that this striving was a self-imposed tyranny. It asked us to live lives of perpetual pre-planning, leaving no room for the unexpected, the lovely accident, or the simple, unscheduled breath. And yet, life refuses to be scheduled. Life is messy. It is full of contradictions, moments of profound clarity followed immediately by utter confusion, intense bursts of joy mingled with inexplicable melancholy. To expect smoothness is to invite constant disappointment. Therefore, the art begins to shift from mastering our environment to accepting its innate beautiful asymmetry. The quiet companion does not make the storms disappear. It simply teaches us where we can stand when they arrive. We have practiced identifying what belongs to us, our intentions, our willingness to observe, and what belongs to the indifferent sweep of fate, the traffic accident, the failed venture, the sudden departure of a loved one. The deepest comfort now lies in radical non-resistance, not indifference, but acceptance with full presence. This means acknowledging that some things simply are, and arguing against their reality is an exhausting battle we cannot win. It is like grappling with the truth. Sometimes, the simplest truth is it just happened. And yet, within this just happened lies incredible freedom. The core discipline now becomes the mastery of observation. To observe our thoughts as mere passing phenomena, like clouds across a vast sky. We no longer grab onto self-criticism or fear of failure and allow them to dictate our mood or action. We see them for what they are, transient energy. They pass, and we continue moving. This is the daily commitment. It means noticing the sunlight on an ordinary wall, feeling the weight of a simple cup in your hand, hearing the rhythm of breath, and letting these small moments be enough. Letting them be the entirety of your reality for that suspended instant of time. The quiet companion suggests that genuine richness is found not in what we accumulate, but in how fully we allow ourselves to simply exist, to inhabit our bodies without constant mental overlay, to participate in a conversation with focused attention, truly hearing the other person before formulating our thoughtful reply. This radical presence becomes the highest form of virtue. We learn that self-acceptance is far kinder than perpetual striving. It means embracing the contradictions within us, the moments when we acted with profound grace and others when we were quick to judge or careless in word. We must treat ourselves, as we have treated others, with the gentle rigor of honest observation and compassionate forgiveness. To walk mindfully is to redefine companionship itself. Our most constant companion will always be our own awareness. It does not require gifts, it does not demand reward, and it cannot be lost. It simply rests there, steady and patiently waiting, reminding us that the best life is one lived moment by moment. So let us walk forward with this understanding. Imperfection is not a failure. It is merely the texture of being alive. The messiness of existence is what gives life its depth and its unpredictable beauty. We are not called to escape the human condition, but to inhabit it fully, the triumphs and the stumbles, the laughter and the silence. Our journey ends not with a triumphant shout, but with a deep, sustainable breath. A gentle return to the present moment, realizing that everything we needed was always available.